Take a breath with me, not to calm down, just to arrive. Because the place we're starting from today isn't weakness, and it isn't failure. It's that quiet, uncomfortable territory you enter when your body begins to collapse long before your life does. When you can still go through the motions, still hold a conversation, still look functional, but inside, something has dimmed. Something essential feels like it's gone offline. Imagine yourself as an ancient stone temple. From the outside, the structure still looks intact. The pillars are upright. The architecture hasn't cracked. But if someone walked inside, they'd notice it immediately. The inner sanctum is dark. The flame that once burned there is flickering low, barely holding shape. This is the moment many men find themselves in without having the language for it. A moment where the outer persona is intact, but the inner self is depleted and asking for a reckoning. Most men misinterpret this moment. That's the first unconscious mistake I want to name early, clearly, and without judgment. When your energy collapses, you assume the problem is laziness, discipline, or character. You attack yourself long before you ever ask what the collapse might be signaling. You treat the body's rebellion as a moral flaw instead of a message. But what if the message is this? Your unconscious is withdrawing energy from a life frame that no longer supports your becoming. There's nothing dramatic about the experience. It doesn't feel like a crisis. It feels like wanting to lie down all day. It feels like moving through fog. It feels like knowing there's work to do, people to answer, decisions waiting. But the internal cables that once carried motivation have gone silent. Most men don't call this a revolt. They call it being tired. But exhaustion is often the last language the psyche uses when it can't get your attention any other way. There's a cultural layer here that's worth naming gently. Many men were raised inside a quiet instruction. Perform strength even when you feel vacant. Stay productive. Stay reliable. Stay composed. No matter how far you've drifted from yourself. And so you learn to separate your body from your truth. You learn to keep going even when the inner rooms are empty. You learn to mistake collapse for a personal defect, rather than a signal that something essential has been overdrawn. When this pattern goes on long enough, the body becomes the messenger for everything the mind has been taught to ignore. Father wound expectations, trauma bond residue, overstimulation that has rewired your dopamine pathways, a shadow that refuses to cooperate with old goals, or a self-concept held together by performances you no longer believe in. The collapse isn't random. It's relational, biological, archetypal, personal. And here's the emotional hook that matters at this stage of the conversation. What you're calling fatigue might actually be forbidden truth leaking through the cracks. Truth about what's no longer working. Truth about the roles you've outgrown. Truth about the version of you the world keeps applauding, and the version of you that keeps disappearing inside that applause. If you want, you can test something quietly as you listen. Notice where your attention goes when you hear the phrase, forbidden truth. For some men, it's the job. For others, it's a relationship that has been silently eroding their sense of self. For others still, it's a dream abandoned so long ago it no longer feels like it belonged to a real person. Nothing has to be solved right now. This chapter is about naming what most men feel, but rarely articulate. The moment when your body falls, so your psyche can finally be heard. And if you stay with me through this video, especially through the midpoint, I'll show you a silent pattern almost every man misreads when his system begins to shut down. A pattern that turns collapse from an enemy into an ally, into the first honest conversation between your body, your shadow, and the life you're actually meant to inhabit. There comes a point in a man's exhaustion where the ordinary explanations stop making sense. You've slept. You've tried caffeine, supplements, new routines. You've promised yourself that tomorrow will be different. But tomorrow arrives, and the same heaviness is waiting at the edge of the bed, as if someone unplugged the internal generator that used to carry you through the day. Many men quietly assume this means something is wrong with their character. That unconscious misinterpretation sits heavy in the background. If energy is gone, it must mean motivation has failed. If drive has thinned out, there must be something defective in the way you're built. But collapse has its own architecture, and it is almost never moral. If you spend time in the corners of the internet where men speak honestly, anonymous forums, late-night threads, long comments under burnout videos, you begin to notice a repeating pattern. A man pushes himself until the persona he's been wearing begins to crack. He keeps performing long after his spirit has run out of reasons, and when his body finally shuts down, he labels it as weakness. What he rarely sees is the deeper mechanism at play, a psychological veto. Jung described this through the withdrawal of libido, not sexual energy but life energy, the current that animates desire, focus, meaning. When a man's outer life drifts too far from his inner truth, that energy pulls back, not out of punishment, but out of protection. The psyche refuses to keep investing in a version of life that no longer supports who he is becoming. This is where the shadow enters, not as a villain, but as the part of you that carries everything you've avoided, repressed, or postponed. The shadow doesn't sabotage your life for drama. It steps in when you've ignored yourself for too long. When the role you're performing demands more than your inner world can continue to provide, the shadow pulls the plug, quietly, firmly, and your body obeys. This is why exhaustion often coincides with subtle sensory changes. For some men, mornings feel numb, as if the world has been turned down to a lower volume. For others, attention collapses into compulsive scrolling, gaming, or mental drifting, not out of pleasure, but out of avoidance. And there are men who describe a strange, almost invisible impulse to disappear from expectations, not out of despair, but out of sheer overwhelm. These are early signs that the nervous system has been overstimulated for too long, while the emotional core has been underfed. Every system has limits, even the psychological ones you were never taught to respect. Here is a reframing that often destabilizes the old narrative. What looks like low energy is sometimes excess energy, with nowhere honest to go. Repressed anger, perfectionistic roles, unspoken grief, the compulsive need to appear calm, the pressure to be the anchor for everyone around you. These forces accumulate until the body slows you down simply to prevent rupture. Avoidance is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is overflow. If you want to sense this in your own experience, you might observe what happens the moment you attempt something that matters to your identity, a decision about your future, a truthful conversation, an application that reflects your potential rather than your fear. Notice how quickly fatigue arrives. Notice the micro-hesitation, the subtle flutter of dread. These are not signs of laziness, but early indicators that your inner world is out of alignment with the role you're performing. There is also a quieter signal most men overlook: irritation toward people who seem decisive or clear, not because you dislike them, but because their clarity amplifies your own confusion. The psyche reacts to this mismatch with tension, and the body responds with collapse. Again, not to shame you, but to slow you down long enough for the truth to surface. And here's the line many men pause on: your collapse is not random, it is patterned. It follows the contours of the roles you inherited, the expectations you absorbed, and the truths you learned to silence. The shadow pulls the plug only when the cost of maintaining the persona exceeds the cost of breaking it. As we move forward, the next step isn't about fixing anything. It's about understanding what your system is fighting for and what it is fighting against. Because beneath every shutdown lies a conflict between meaning and survival, and most men live in that conflict without recognizing it. 2 chapters ahead, we will test this tension against a real cross-cultural story that exposes the core wound beneath the paralysis. But before we get there, we need to explore the day your drive dies, not as a failure of discipline, but as the moment your inherited scripts collide with your instincts. There is a moment in a man's life when his drive doesn't just fade, it disappears. Not gradually, not politely, but with a kind of quiet finality, almost like a switch flipped somewhere deep inside a room he's never entered. One day he could push through anything, and the next, even simple tasks feel heavy, distant, unapproachable. This is the moment many men misread most painfully. They assume it means something is wrong with them as a man. That unconscious conclusion settles quickly. If motivation is gone, there must be something flawed at the core. But the loss of drive is rarely a defect. More often, it is a signal that 2 forces inside you have finally collided: your instincts and the scripts you inherited long before you had language to question them. If you listen to men in burnout interviews, the long-form conversations where they finally speak freely, you'll hear a recurring theme. Many describe a father figure, or the absence of one, who taught them that enough is never enough. Not through words, but through atmosphere. through the expectation that a man endures, a man takes it. A man keeps going, even when something inside him is quietly collapsing. So they grow up learning to override themselves, to push past every limit, to prove their worth through survival. But there is only so long a system can run on borrowed expectations. Biologically, this has consequences. When the body is exposed to prolonged stress and responsibility without emotional replenishment, cortisol doesn't just spike, it lingers. Over time, it reshapes your relationship with reward. Dopamine becomes muted. The spark that once made effort feel meaningful begins to dim. What used to be manageable suddenly feels punishing. You're not lazy, you're neurochemically signaling misalignment. The body is saying what the mind has been trained to ignore. And here is one of the reframing lines that shifts the ground under many men. The psyche does not shut down because you lack discipline. It shuts down because discipline was misused to uphold roles that were never aligned with who you actually are. The drive that disappears is often a drive that never truly belonged to you in the first place. It belonged to the identity you felt obligated to maintain. The reliable one, the strong one, the man who says yes, the man who carries what others drop, the one who keeps moving even when no one asks how he's doing. When that inherited persona becomes too expensive to sustain, the psyche withdraws its funding. This is where myth can illuminate what psychology describes. In the Iliad, Achilles doesn't leave the battlefield because he becomes afraid. He withdraws because something in the role he is asked to play becomes fundamentally insulting to his inner truth. His retreat is an act of alignment, not avoidance. For many men today, the collapse of drive is a similar protest, a refusal to keep participating in a life that diminishes them. A quiet insistence that something inside needs to be renegotiated. But here's the part that often lands with a sting, the kind that makes a man pause the video for a minute. You may be calling this collapse a lack of ambition, when in truth, it is a rebellion against the ambitions you were never meant to inherit. That's the confrontation most men avoid. Because if the drive you've lost was never authentically yours, then the question becomes unsettling. What would your life look like if you stopped borrowing your purpose from expectation and started listening to instinct? Some men discover this in the starkest moments, sitting in a parked car after work, unable to turn the key, standing in the kitchen staring at a sink full of dishes that feel impossible, opening a laptop and feeling your entire body resist the next step. These moments are not trivial. They are psychological thresholds, the point at which the body refuses to cooperate with the performance of a self that no longer fits. And yet, even here, something in you still cares. You wouldn't feel this friction if you were indifferent. Collapse is not indifference. Collapse is the soul's way of stopping you before you continue betraying yourself. The next turning point is understanding what the psyche is protesting. Because beneath the shutdown is always a deeper truth, one that most men won't see unless someone names it for them. In the next chapter, we step into that territory, the place where procrastination stops being about avoidance and starts revealing the truths a man fears to confront. There is a particular kind of stillness that appears in a man's life when he thinks he is procrastinating. He feels himself hesitate at the edge of a task, not because the task is difficult, but because something inside tightens. Something pulls him back from the threshold. He calls it laziness, distraction, lack of discipline. But beneath that label, a deeper truth waits to be acknowledged. Procrastination is often the mask. What hides behind it is far more intimate. The fear that if you move forward, you will confront a truth about yourself you're not ready to see. Men speak about this quietly in late-night threads and anonymous posts. They say things like, "If I stop moving, I'm afraid of what I'll find," or "I don't want to look too closely at my life because I'm not sure I would recognize myself." There is a kind of trembling honesty in those confessions. They reveal that avoidance is rarely about effort. It is about exposure. Jung would describe this moment as the emergence of a complex, a cluster of old memories, emotions and beliefs that activate together when the psyche feels threatened. One of the most common is the inadequacy complex, not because a man truly lacks capacity, but because he learned early that identity must be earned rather than inhabited. He learned to measure himself against idealized versions of masculinity, versions so polished that any human hesitation feels like failure. When that complex activates, the body intervenes. Fatigue arrives like a fog. Attention scatters. A simple message becomes difficult to send. A meaningful decision becomes strangely heavy. The task hasn't changed, but the story behind it has. The psyche is not resisting work, it is resisting exposure. Here is a reframing that often unsettles old assumptions. Avoidance is not fear of effort, it is fear of truth. The truth that the identity you're carrying cannot deliver the future you keep imagining. The truth that some part of you is hungry for a different life, a different rhythm, a different definition of strength. The truth that your current way of being may no longer be sustainable, and admitting that would require confronting everything you've postponed. This is why certain moments feel heavier than they should. A pause before sending a job application. A sudden wave of exhaustion before initiating a boundary. A faint irritation toward men who appear decisive or aligned. These are not signs of moral failure. They are signals of fragmentation. Two parts of you pulling in opposite directions. One wants to grow. One wants to stay familiar. The body lands in the middle and refuses to move. You can see the pattern in the small, almost secret indicators men rarely name aloud. The micro pauses before starting something meaningful, as if waiting for permission from an authority that no longer exists. The spike of irritation or envy when witnessing someone else's clarity, because it mirrors a clarity you fear you've lost. The strange, sudden fatigue that arrives exactly when you approach something self-defining. These moments are psychological breadcrumbs. They lead back to an identity that no longer fits. And here is another perspective that shifts the ground. Procrastination often appears when you are standing between two archetypes. The lover who longs, imagines, feels deeply, and the warrior who chooses, protects, and acts. When neither archetype feels safe to inhabit, the psyche freezes. The lover collapses under overstimulation. The warrior retreats when he has no direction he believes in. The result is paralysis. Not because you're incapable, but because you're unanchored. If you want to explore this without forcing anything, one experiment can gently open the door. The next time you feel yourself freezing before a task that carries emotional weight, pause internally and ask, not as a challenge but as curiosity, if I moved forward right now, what truth about me might come to the surface? You don't have to solve it. You don't have to act on it. Just noticing the first honest answer can illuminate the landscape of your resistance. What often emerges is not a flaw, but a forgotten need. Not a weakness, but a boundary that was never allowed to form. Not a failure of will, but a revelation that the self you've been presenting cannot continue unchanged. And this leads us directly to the next threshold. Because when a man starts to see the truth behind his resistance, he enters the deeper conflict, the tension between the lover who collapses and the warrior who has gone silent. A tension that shapes the entire midpoint of this journey. There is a moment in a man's inner life when two forces he depends on stop cooperating, not out of malice, not out of failure, but because the system that once held them together can no longer contain the strain. This is the archetypal standoff, an inner conflict that often becomes visible only when the body finally lies down and refuses to rise. To understand this turning point, imagine the psyche as a house with two central rooms. In one room lives the lover, the part of you that feels deeply, imagines, dreams, longs for connection, beauty, meaning. In the other lives, the warrior, the part that acts, protects, decides, and moves with conviction. When these two rooms communicate, a man feels alive and directed. When they drift apart, energy dissolves. Many men, especially in periods of burnout, describe this drift without having the words for it. They say their sensitivity has become overwhelming. They feel overstimulated by emotion, memory, disappointment, or the sheer weight of wanting more from life than the roles they've been taught to play. This is the lover in collapse, not because he is weak, but because he is saturated. Desire without direction becomes exhaustion. At the same time, the warrior retreats. Not because he has disappeared, but because he refuses to act without legitimacy. Action without meaning becomes violence against the self, and the warrior knows this before the conscious mind does. When a man no longer believes in the narrative guiding his life, the warrior steps back and watches, silent and unresolved. This is often the moment when men describe feeling unrecognizable to themselves. They are neither fully emotional nor fully decisive. They are suspended between longing and action, unable to commit to either. And the psyche, sensing the imbalance, withdraws energy from both. The result is paralysis, not a flaw, not a collapse of character, but a restructuring under the surface. Here is a reframing that can be quietly disorienting. Lying down all day is not the lover abandoning strength. It is the warrior refusing to move forward without a purpose he can believe in. A man can push himself into motion, but he cannot fake alignment. When inner authority is absent, the body stops. This tension becomes clearer when you look at a story many men resonate with. In one widely shared account, a Brazilian engineer described a long period of internal paralysis after ending a relationship that shaped his entire sense of self. He believed he was grieving the breakup. What he eventually discovered was far more complex. His identity, the caretaker, the stabilizer, the helper, only made sense inside that relationship's turbulence. When it ended, the narrative holding his life together dissolved. For months, he felt unable to act, unable to choose, unable to care about goals he once pursued. What broke wasn't his motivation. It was the storyline that gave his motivation meaning. His lover had been overstimulated by emotional chaos, and his warrior had no mission outside that chaos. Once both collapsed, all that remained was stillness. What allowed his energy to slowly return was not discipline, nor productivity hacks, nor pressure to get over it. It was the gradual construction of a new internal contract. A contract where the lover could feel without being consumed, and the warrior could choose without sacrificing self-respect. When he stopped defining himself through rescuing others, his inner authority began to strengthen, and with that, energy returned, not as a sudden surge, but as a quiet, steady flame. This midpoint matters because it reveals something most men sense but rarely articulate. Collapse is often the negotiation phase between two archetypes trying to reorganize your inner world. The system is not failing, it is renegotiating. And here is another destabilizing truth that can reshape everything that comes next. Nothing changes until you confront the script that governs why these archetypes fell out of alignment in the first place. A script absorbed so early, so silently, that you may not realize you've been living under its weight. In the next chapter, we step directly into that script, the forbidden one that shapes the entire cycle of collapse. There is a sentence woven into many men's lives so early and so quietly that they grow into adulthood believing it is simply the truth about how the world works. The sentence is almost invisible, yet it governs how they love, how they work, how they endure, and ultimately, how they collapse. It sounds like this: if I stop performing, I will lose love. Some men learned this through a parent whose approval depended on achievement. Others learned it from a mother whose emotional stability depended on their compliance. Others absorbed it from environments where care was conditional, where affection arrived only when they excelled, soothed, or stayed small. It doesn't always come through words. Often it arrives through atmosphere, through the subtle tightening in the room when a boy expressed his needs, or the sudden warmth when he suppressed them. By the time he becomes a man, the script is no longer conscious. It feels like instinct. He says yes when he means no. He carries more than his share. He becomes the steady one, the reliable one, the man who absorbs tension without complaint. He convinces himself that self-sacrifice is love, that endurance is virtue, that exhaustion is simply part of being responsible. But the price of that script eventually comes due. The nervous system begins to protest long before the mind does. When identity maintenance becomes too expensive, when the effort required to uphold the persona exceeds the emotional resources available, the threat circuits activate. The body does not panic, it freezes. Muscles go heavy, thoughts go blank, choices feel distant. This freeze is not failure. It is the psyche interrupting a contract that has gone on for too long. Here is a reframing that can quietly change everything. The collapse you experience is not your downfall. It is your refusal. Your psyche is refusing to fuel a version of yourself that survives through self-abandonment, refusing to uphold a persona that protects others while erasing you.
Refusing to serve the old master, the script you inherited before you learned to name your needs. This refusal often feels like fatigue, numbness, or detachment, but beneath those sensations lies something far more radical, the beginnings of liberation. Men often believe their exhaustion means they are not trying hard enough. But collapse rarely appears when a man is weak. It appears when he is done.
When something inside him knows he cannot become who he is meant to be if he keeps performing who he was trained to be. And this is where the psyche becomes precise. Collapse isn't random. It interrupts you exactly where the script is strongest. For some men, the shutdown happens at work, the moment they try to take on yet another responsibility without acknowledgement. For others, it happens in relationships, the moment they are expected to keep giving without reciprocity. For others still, it appears when they approach the life they truly want, because pursuing it would mean disappointing the people who raised them. At this point in the journey, clarity becomes possible, but only if it arrives gently. If you want to explore this without pressure, there is an experiment that can illuminate the contract you've been serving. Not to fix anything, not to force an insight, but simply to reveal what has been operating in the background. One experiment, if you choose to try it, is to sit inside a moment of collapse, not with judgment, but with curiosity, and ask 2 questions inwardly. The first, who am I protecting by staying collapsed? Sometimes the answer is apparent from your childhood. Sometimes it is a partner you feel responsible for. Sometimes it is the part of you that believes invisibility is safety. The second, who am I betraying by not standing? And here the answer is often the version of you that has waited quietly for years, the one who longs for clearer boundaries, more honest connections, a life not built on appeasing others. You don't need to act on the answers. You don't need to change anything immediately. Simply seeing the architecture of your loyalty can shift the entire internal landscape. Because once the hidden contract becomes visible, collapse takes on a new meaning. It stops being a sign that something inside you is broken. It becomes the first sign that something inside you is finally refusing to break any further. This prepares the ground for the final movement of this journey. The moment where collapse reveals its purpose, not to end your momentum, but to rebuild your center on foundations that no longer require self-erasure. There is a quiet moment, often at the end of a long period of collapse, when something inside you begins to shift. Not dramatically, not with a surge of motivation or a sudden breakthrough. It feels more like the soft clearing of smoke after a fire, a sense that beneath the charred remains, the ground is still warm, still alive, still capable of holding new roots. This moment matters because it reframes everything that came before it. What looked like failure begins to reveal itself as a transition. What felt like the end of your drive becomes the beginning of a different kind of alignment. The collapse wasn't the final word. It was the pause required for the next word to make sense. A helpful image here is the forest after a wildfire. To an untrained eye, it looks devastated, stripped of life. But ecologists will tell you something else is happening. The fire opens seeds that only germinate under intense heat. The soil becomes richer, more fertile. A new ecosystem begins, one truer to the environment than what stood before. Collapse in a man's life often functions the same way. It clears the ground of identities that demanded too much, roles that weakened him, expectations he could not continue to serve. And here is a reframing that draws the entire journey into focus. The desire to lie down all day is not the end of willpower. It is the beginning of individuation. When your psyche withdraws energy from false identities, it is not abandoning you. It is trying to return you to yourself. It is redirecting your strength towards something more coherent, something that doesn't require self-abandonment to maintain. Stillness, in this context, becomes more than inactivity. It becomes recalibration. Exhaustion becomes more than depletion. It becomes a boundary, a line drawn by the body where the mind refused to draw one. And collapse becomes more than a shutdown. It becomes a form of truth-telling, the soul's way of saying, this version of life can no longer hold me. If you look closely at your own patterns, you may notice this. Your energy tends to return not when you push harder, but when you stop forcing yourself into shapes that were never yours to hold. When you begin choosing honesty over performance. When you allow your inner world to guide your outer one, instead of the other way around. This journey is not about becoming a different man. It is about reclaiming the one you were before exhaustion taught you to disappear. As this chapter closes, one gentle question remains. A question that marks the beginning of a new internal stance. If the collapse was protecting you, what part of you is ready to stand again? Not in defiance, but in truth. The answer doesn't have to be clear. It only has to be honest. And if you feel something in this video mapped your inner landscape, You're free to leave one sentence below, not as a performance, not as a confession, but as a signal. Someone else may recognize themselves through your clarity, and that recognition alone can become the beginning of their own rebuilding.